Horizon. It's my pleasure to welcome you to today's event, China's Investment Model in the Developing World. I'm going to just make a few quick opening remarks here, and then we'll move right to our panel. I see some familiar faces in here, and I see some unfamiliar faces in the room. So, just to give you a quick background on why we're here, CIPE is a unique institution. We're an affiliate of the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, but we're also a member of the National Endowment for Democracy. And as such, we often look at the intersection of economic reform, private sector development, and both democratic and non-democratic governance around the world. As an institution that deals with this intersection between business and democracy, we are, in essence, a governance institute quite often, because we're looking at the legal and regulatory environment that business has to function in and the institutions that govern its functioning. We also focus a lot on norms, because in international trade and in international investment, we've always lived in a globalized world and under a series of norms, whether those are trade norms, labor norms, environmental norms, other types of enforcement norms. They've played an important part of how we've constructed our global economy in the world. But as with many other aspects of globalization, I think the crisis of globalization recently has started to call into question how the world does business and how investment flows and what are the links between investment and good governance. And it's certainly with the rise of investment and in becoming a global affair, investment is no longer just the realm of Western multinational companies or Western banks or Western finance institutions investing into emerging markets, but it is truly now a global industry. And we need to understand, I think, more about these institutions. So at CIPE, we're asking ourselves the question, does the rise of alternative sources of capital affect the development and performance of these institutions and norms? And in particular here at CIPE, we've been recently focusing on a term that we're using right now, essentially called corrosive capital. And now, what is corrosive capital? Corrosive capital is capital which might flow into an economy that might have a detrimental effect on local governance systems, local standards, local transparency and accountability. It may not in itself cause these things, but it may not have a reinforcing effect either. And in essence, it starts to change the nature of the norms for investment and that we've been holding dear all these years. So we need to start understanding, I think, what is the nature of these investments? Is it indeed having a corrosive effect on norms? And how do we differentiate between what is essentially just risk capital, and that would be money that's flowing from sources that have a higher tolerance for risk, be that political risk, risk of corruption or other issues, versus corrosive capital, which may have a political motivation behind it, which may have other directives. So last week, for instance, we did a roundtable with the Helsinki Commission up on the Hill, looking at patterns of Russian investment in the Balkans and trying to understand not only just the scale and nature of the investment, but how did that affect the decisions that governments make. With Chinese lending, we've recently seen, for instance, the case in Sri Lanka with the port. Where the government of Sri Lanka perhaps made an unwise loan decision or borrowing decision, which has had implications for the country moving forward. So we're not saying we're going to stop the flow of funds from countries. What we're saying is that as these flows enter into our system of global norms, how do we ensure that countries have the tools at hand that they need to help ensure that these types of investments and these types of loans and interactions with this risk capital or this corrosive capital doesn't do harm or have negative effects to the governance standards in a country. So we're kind of trying to do that here at CIPE right now. And if we can identify if there are certain patterns, how can we help countries and our partners around the world develop the tools that they need? Now, CIPE is very much a demand-driven organization. We often come at this because we have a network of partners around the world who come to us and say, we really want to look at a certain situation. And in the case of Chinese capital, it really is coming out of our partnerships with countries in Southeastern Europe and in Sub-Saharan Africa, who are starting to deal with Chinese policy vis-a-vis the Belt and Road issues and other things. They're preparing for an influx of capital. They're preparing for an influx of investment. The question is, how can they understand the nature of these investments, and how can they observe them as watchdogs? So our objective today is really to better understand the nature of Chinese investments and aid flows and their impact on the governance system. And just to kind of put this in perspective, although China still itself receives a massive amount of foreign direct investment, its outbound investments this year are at $145 billion, and those actually exceeded their inbound investments, which were at $135 billion. That was 2015 numbers. So China is now becoming a net exporter of capital. And in 2016, China made more than $220 billion of outward investments. So they are a player in the global markets, and how we understand that is better. And our goal here really is to listen to experts today who understand better than we do the nature of these investments with a variety of viewpoints. And so I'd like to take the opportunity to quickly introduce our panel. We do have more detailed bios available to you outside, but just briefly, our first, to my immediate right, is David Barboza. He's a correspondent with the New York Times, and he's reported on Chinese business at least since 2008, when you were in Shanghai, I believe. And he's received a Pulitzer Prize for his work. And he's currently working on a project examining Chinese corporate structures. Next to him is Deborah Brottingham. She's the director of the China-Africa Research Initiative at SAIS. And her work aims to explore the many myths and misunderstandings surrounding Chinese investment on the African continent. Next to her is Sun Yun. She's a senior associate at the Stimson Center, just upstairs, and a good friend of ours. And she works in the Stimson Center on East Asia, and she specializes on Chinese foreign policy in the developing world. And finally, we have Andre Soros. He's a counselor for the board of directors at the Inter-American Development Bank, and he's going to offer us a development bank perspective on how Chinese investment and development strategies differ from the other models we're seeing in the world today. So I've got a question for all of our panelists to start off with, and we'll just maybe work our way down the row in terms of responses, and then we'll have some follow-up questions for you. But this goes right to the heart of our conundrum here. Given the scarcity of data and reliance on anecdotes regarding Chinese investment, what can we say with certainty about the impact of Chinese investments on both public governance and also sustained economic growth? David, let's start with you.
So, thank you. So I'm coming to it from a perspective of having lived in China from 2004 to the end of 2015. So I'm really looking at Chinese companies in China. But I think what we know, and I've studied a little in the U.S., the Chinese investment in the U.S., and I think actually with this first question, it's really too early to say. China, even inside of China, it's hard to understand who the investors are, who the shareholders are, who the owners are of some companies, all the things that are happening because of transparency weaknesses inside of China. So when they're investing abroad, it's really going to be country by country. What is the nature of the transparency in that country? Is there good journalism in that country? How does that country deal with NGOs, etc.? I know there have been lots of studies on Chinese investment in Africa and Latin America, but I think they are looking at the immediate impact. So to think about the sustainability or the governance when China is only just beginning to make major investments. So I've been writing this year last year about one Chinese company, a company called HNA, you've probably heard of, making $30 billion of investments in the US. So we're trying to look at, okay, what does that mean? It's a private company with state capital. They have lobbying firms in the U.S. They're joining the United Nations, UNICEF. So I think we're at the beginning stages of understanding not only where Chinese are investing, but what are the types of investments? Are they state investments? Are they strategic investments? We're also seeing more private companies, private capital flowing out of China, and those would be a sort of a different perspective, but even a private company in China is going to be closely tied to the state, so it's not necessarily that the state investment is a government investment and the private investment is a non-government investment, because the private investor from China may well also be there for government strategic purposes. So, sorry, I think in sum I would say really too early, not a lot of evidence, not enough evidence out there that I see about what are the long-term impacts on corporate governance and sustainability.
Is the evidence, just as a quick follow-up, is the evidence a function of just this is a new phenomenon, or is this a difficulty accessing information?
Both. I mean, for me, so one of the things I'm trying to study is to understand the Chinese companies from inside of China before they go out, or to find their investments outside and then trace that back to who are the companies inside, who are their shareholders, are they state, is the state involved, what kind of shareholder is this, what's their track record inside of China, and also I try to look at the patterns of the company before it leaves China. So I think generally when you think about this question, you have to say the company going outside of the country will bring with it some of the ideas, the norms, the culture that it has developed inside. It will take that outside. So I want to understand what type of company, what type of corporate governance does it have inside of China, forget what it does outside, and then to see if there's some correlation. And I think generally you can expect if the company is not following the rules inside of China, it's probably not following the rules outside of China. And if it's a more transparent company, more established, you can understand a lot of things about where the money came from, et cetera, probably is going to have a little better track record outside of China.
Mm-hmm. Deborah, we were talking before we sat down, and the issue of accurate information becomes important, but also in the sense of what's reality, right? We hear a lot of anecdotes, we see a lot of big numbers, a lot of people draw some immediate conclusions from those. What can you tell us? So you've been looking at this in the African context, where there's been a lot of discussion about these things and a lot of, a lot of maybe fog being generated. And a lot of talking, but what in your view is the real picture here that we should be looking at?
That's pretty hard to answer. I really can only speak to Africa. We look at Africa, the China-Africa Research Initiative, and we look at Africa intensely and deeply, and largely Chinese loans, Chinese investment, Chinese aid to Africa. And even there, our data isn't perfect. I think it's the best out there, but it's not perfect. And there are a lot of sources of data, and they're flawed, and this makes it very hard for us to gain an accurate picture about what China's doing. And if we don't have an accurate picture, it's a lot harder to ascertain the impact. We can get anecdotes, but to do a econometric analysis, you need good data. So the data that we do have, we have FDI data, and as a lot of people who track Chinese data know, the FDI data is flawed, in part because about 57% of the official figures show the FDI data going through Hong Kong. And so once it gets into Hong Kong's an offshore financial center, and we don't know where it goes after that, because it could be British capital, it could be American capital coming out of Hong Kong. It's not specifically linked to China or to mainland China. So from that data, it looks like about 3% of Chinese investment is going into Africa. But we know the figures are larger than that. And they're larger in part because things like ADEX's purchase of petroleum assets, or China's purchase of ADEX's petroleum assets, they ended up being a transfer to Switzerland because ADEX was based in Switzerland. And yet there were assets in Cameroon, and Nigeria, even in Iraq that came with that. So those were investments in those areas, but they don't show up in the data. And conversely, we have individual investment data, which comes from the Ministry of Commerce, and its individual project approvals. So this data is also flawed. We've been checking it on a country-by-country basis, looking at manufacturing investments, and we're finding that just a small fraction of the approvals ever translate into actual investments. And so if people are using that to try to do their econometric analyses, they're also going to have problems because it's not a good reflection of what's actually happening on the ground. And then there's the Aid Data group at William & Mary. We checked just recently their top 10 loans that were purportedly coming from China into Africa. They listed a $2 billion railway in Sudan, $1.5 billion budget support also in Sudan. Neither of these ever happened. They double counted the Ethiopia railway loans. They listed a railway $2 billion in Cote d'Ivoire, which never happened. So these kinds of distortions are also going to create problems if you're trying to do econometric analysis. So I'd say that the best research out there so far is people who collect their own data, who do it by going to countries, by doing interviews, and by actually doing fact-checking there. And in that regard, I think I came out a couple of years ago with a book on Chinese investment in the agricultural sector, because I was curious. I was reading so much about how Chinese companies were grabbing land all across Africa. And so I went to a number of different countries, all the places where I could find where the newspaper reports said there were large amounts of land going to Chinese companies. And we found just a very small fraction of those investments. There was interest, but most of them just never happened, in part because of all the obstacles to actually getting investments done. So we've talked about a lot of things, particularly before our panel began, about why Chinese are going to different places, why they're moving out, what their investment model means for developing countries. And I think that in Africa, there has been for a long time a feeling that this is going to be a really negative effect. It's going to have a negative effect on the continent. And I think we're not finding that by and large. And why would Chinese investment worsen governance? And I can think of 4 possible reasons. And the first is that it would reduce the traditional leverage, the leverage of the traditional donors. And there's we can think that perhaps that is happening. But research that has been done on this, that has done surveys of the traditional donors, finds that only about 20% of them think that Chinese lending or Chinese aid has any impact on their own portfolios or on their relationship with the countries where they're working. And it's because the Chinese are working in very different sectors. They're working in productive sectors, they're working in infrastructure, and the traditional donors are mostly in the social sector. So the countries still need both of those, and so they still have that leverage. Or would it happen because the Chinese seek out countries like themselves, authoritarian dictatorships, in order to partner with? Well, we find that that's not the case. The Chinese will partner with authoritarian dictatorships, but they're just as happy to partner with democratic countries. So they want to go where they can make money. Or do they actively promote their own model? Are they trying to get other countries to become authoritarian, capitalist, rogue countries? We don't see evidence of this. We don't see any programs in which they're trying to get other countries to behave like theirs. There is interest in promoting things like special economic zones, which are part of the Chinese model. And the last thing is that the Chinese are not constrained by things like the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act. Does this have an impact? And I think here is where we have the most concern, because that's absolutely the case. The Chinese companies are only very infrequently impeded by the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act or Europe's own similar legislations. And we can see cases of a Hong Kong person with ties to Beijing who has recently been arrested under that act. But this happens very rarely. And so this creates real competition, I think, and possibly nefarious impacts. Is it making governance worse? Probably not making it better. I'm not sure it's actually making it actively worse, but it does create obstacles for other efforts in that regard.
Great. Yun.
Yeah.
Your specialty is on foreign policy. I don't know if you have a particular angle you want to bring to that in regards to the first question we've asked on what do we know clearly about the nature of these things?
What do we know? Well, first of all, it depends on which project and which country. I think there's a, like Deborah pointed out, it's very difficult to generalize across the board. China's pattern in Latin America is similar to what it is doing in Africa, but there are differences. And I would say the Chinese investment behavior closer to China's homeland, for example, in Southeast Asia, South Asia, and Central Asia, is very different from China's behavior pattern in areas that are much further away from the Chinese periphery. So I think generalization is hard. We have to look at case by case and country by country, sometimes region by region, and then we can identify some patterns. And here, I really would like to compliment Deborah's work because Deborah really focuses on individual cases or individual countries, what Chinese companies are doing in Madagascar, or what Chinese companies or China as a whole is doing in Ethiopia. I think those kind of research is now required, that we cannot just generalize about what China is doing in Africa. We have to be more specific than that. The second thought I have is I agree with David. I think the long-term effect of Chinese investment, the jury on that is still out. We have to give it more time to see, especially for the BRI projects. So most of them have been basically approved and implemented in the past 5 years, not even 5 years. So I think it's too early to assess their long-term effect over public governance and sustainable economic growth locally in the recipient countries. And the last point I would like to make is that one thing consistent about all this inconsistency is that different parties have different stories. Even if we're looking at one project, one port, or one railway project, we're going to get different feedback from the Chinese government, from the Chinese companies, from the recipient government, and from the civil society or the people in the recipient country. So to have a full picture of what we are really assessing, we need to put all these different pieces together. We cannot just rely on one source to draw a conclusion about the nature and the impact of these projects. So in most cases, I would say the Chinese government's usual line is we're doing great for the local society, we're creating jobs, we're also creating economic growth, we're building roads and infrastructure projects that they would never have otherwise. So there's a very big self-compliment there when you look at the statements from the Chinese government. But if you look at the Chinese cooperation statements, it's usually much more nuanced. Is that while this project is not only serving China's national interest, it's also serving the company's economic interest, it also serves the local people's interest. So it's win-win-win, win for everybody. And Chinese financiers, if you look at CDB, well, CDB is doing less outside China now, but the Export and Import Bank of China is doing more, for example, under Belt and Road, along with Silk Road Fund. If you look at what the financiers are saying, they're more concentrated on the financial picture. Are these projects commercially viable? Are we making money, or are we losing money? Or if we're losing money, what are we gaining in return? So these different players focus on different things. The recipients' governments are usually complementary because they don't want to say bad things to piss off the Chinese financiers or the Chinese government. But then if you go into the country and do private interviews with government officials, or with business leaders from the local community, then you get a very different story as for what the locals are really thinking about the Chinese projects on the ground.
Do you think, I think all donors learn from their mistakes. Sometimes that's through formal evaluation, and certainly that's a growing trend in development. We want to have evidence-led development decisions. Are we seeing signs that there is a feedback loop in these projects? So what people are saying on the ground in the African governments is getting back to Beijing, and that they're hearing these messages, or is it just not existing?
It exists, but it exists in different segments of the. Well, we talk about China as if it is one single China, but China is not monolithic. I would say these commercial calculations or these local complaints, they're reflected mostly through the commercial channels, where they raise concerns with Chinese bankers. Like Exim will be concerned that are we losing our money? Or especially the Chinese companies who are doing their own investment, who are responsible for the final outcome of these projects, they are more concerned. And I do think that they reflect their concerns upwards. But then there's a whole different political story. that are sometimes in conflict with the economic story. Like, for example, Belt and Road Initiative is regarded as this grand foreign strategy campaign by President Xi. So people are not supposed to criticize it. Or if you want to criticize it, you better come up with constructive advice on the problems or on the issues that you are criticizing. So that's where the politics gets involved in this economic calculation. Like, another example is CPEC, China-Pakistan Economic Corridor. There are a lot of concerns, not only outside China, but also inside China, about is this really safe? Like, yesterday, 2 Chinese citizens from Chinese companies doing construction in Pakistan, they got shot on the streets in Karachi.
Yeah.
So then the question is that are these investments, is almost $60 billion that China has committed to Pakistan, is it really going to transpire, or is that really a bad decision? But then, on the other hand, you have this counter-argument that CPEC is a flagship project for Belt and Road Initiative, so it cannot fail. It's also one project that President Xi Jinping has personally invested a lot of his credibility and his compliments in. So even if you feel that it may not raise the most optimal investment outcome, you focus on other things, like how about the strategic investment or the strategic interest China will be able to harvest from CPEC. Or another counter-argument that you constantly hear about CPEC is that, well, we cannot afford for Pakistan to fail. So yes, these investments might in the end fail, or to a certain extent not generate the outcomes that we wanted to see, but the alternative is worse. So there are different ways to spin the story.
That's a Pakistani narrative, I think, that's been floating around Washington, too. I don't think Beijing is immune to that one.
Agreed.
Andre, we're sort of touching on the development finance angles here, and you're bringing a perspective from the IDB in Latin America.
Yeah.
You know, what do we know from your perspective about what are the facts here that you're observing on the ground that help us sort of start off by trying to ground our discussion in what we do know?
Sure. Well, first, Andrew, thank you for the invitation. I think I would rather feel more comfortable talking as a former research coordinator from the China-Brazil Business Council.
Okay.
And as a disclaimer, it's going to be my opinion and not the bank's opinion. But I couldn't agree more with Deborah on how, like, it's very difficult for you to get data from Chinese FDI at the China-Brazil Business Council, and then I think they passed the slides that we have the information. We started like 7 or 8 years ago. They started, and I was there as a research coordinator, try to track the investments, and we would see what would be announced by the media. We would send people to the countryside to see if they were actually investing in that farmland or something, and we developed this network where for 7 to 8 years now, we've been tracking Chinese FDI with the government and other players in the country. And the characteristics that we see from the FDI that we were able to account in Brazil are very different from what would be the common sense. It's kind of different from what is the general sense of it. And the first thing that you can see on the graphs is that the Chinese, they learn over the last like 5 to 6 years on how to navigate, at least in a complex market like Brazil, in terms of regulation. So in 2011, when we did the research for the first time, we were only able to confirm 30% of what the Chinese were announcing that they would invest. The latest number that they sent me from last year, they were able to confirm 65%, which means that like they learned in the last like 5 to 6 years. They didn't confirm a lot of these investments. And another thing that we saw that was very interesting is that it's difficult sometimes just to analyze the investment considering the value of this investment. So you often hear like billions and billions of dollars going to the oil sector or going to the mining sector. But these are projects that usually they require billions of dollars in investments. And a lot of the times people don't pay attention to those like 400 million, 500 million, 600 million dollars projects that they go to other sides of the economy, that they mainly go to the industry. So we have a chart there that shows that if you see the amount of investments from the number of projects and you compare them from the volume of projects, you have two different pictures. So I have an example, Sinochem when they bought Statoil ASA in Brazil. That was like, I think, a $7 billion investment that was able to keep or maintain 700 jobs there. Chery Automobile, which is an independent small company from Qihue in China, was able to like go to Brazil and would create 400 jobs there. So the impacts of those investments are also not always related to the amount of the investments that you're making in the economy. And we're able to see that, and we saw that like with time, you see the Chinese diversifying their market in Brazil, for example. If you're Brazilian in Rio right now, like my brother, he can have like a Chinese car, he can have a Chinese washing machine, he can have a Chinese television, and he's going to go on a subway on a like Chinese train to work. And that's very different from what people usually think about in terms of the investment. Another thing that we saw that was very interesting is that in 2010, 2011, you would see a lot of state-owned enterprise or central state-owned enterprise investing in Brazil. Those were kind of like the government-to-government agreements that you would have, and then the Chinese would invest. But with time, you've been seeing like more of private or hybrid Chinese companies entering the Brazilian market. You see the case of TT, the taxi sharing that they compete with Uber buying the 99 car in Brazil. We actually had our first unicorn in Brazil right now because of a Chinese that bought us, and that creates like a market for digital companies in Brazil to be acquired by these Chinese companies that want to internationalize. And they're not actually ready to compete in the American market, so they go to like a Brazil market or a developing country market. So in conclusion, it's just as an introduction here, it's very different. I agree with all the problems that we have in terms of getting the data and doing the econometrics. An engineer would love to have like those data and run the regressions, but it's important that not only Brazil but other countries keep doing this kind of report or research where you go and you try to figure out exactly what is happening on the ground and what are the characteristics that you have there, because it ends up being much more complex than what people usually think.
David, I think that one of the common strands we're hearing, obviously, is access to information.
Mm-hmm.
At CIPE, we've always been very focused on corporate governance. Mm-hmm. And you made a few tangential comments about corporate governance in firms in China. One of those issues that hangs out there is especially transparency in Chinese finance with state-owned banks and other things. What levels of transparency, are you seeing an evolution in transparency in firms, especially those that are going into the global markets? Is this a trend where we're going to have more ease of access to corporate information and investment information? Should we be hopeful?
Yeah.
And also, well, let's start with that, and I might follow up with you on something.
Yeah. So this is one of these, I just don't know how to boil down the complexity of trying to look at China, because sort of everything that I'm looking at as far as transparency and corporate governance and corporate structure, it flips when you get deep into the research. So when I went to China, everyone said, China's not a very transparent country, and you're not going to find a lot of corporate data. And in fact, it took me a long time in China looking at corporate data, but I ended up finding that China has some of the best private company corporate data of any country in the world right now. So I can go and find basically the owner of any company in China by going through China's own government records of corporate ownership. Now, because the business leaders know that there is this great private company data, they create lots of companies around the company they set up to hide the ultimate owners. So you've got both incredible transparency and then a reaction against incredible transparency by creating lots of shell companies, offshore companies, Hong Kong companies, Cayman Island companies. So the possibility of finding the answer is there, but it's going to take a long time. And I think this is sort of a symbol of what I had in so many different experiences in China about how things operate. It is both more transparent and less transparent, or more transparent and far more complex at the same time. But the possibility, I always try to focus on the positive in here, is if you really want to know, there is a path. It may be a long path, but there's a path, and China has great records. like I said, some of the best records. I can do research in China that I cannot do in the US, in some areas, in corporate ownership of private companies. In talking about FDI, you see even Chinese companies that go overseas, set up an entity overseas, and then invest in China as a foreign company. So this happens all the time. So you have to end up tracing the company all the way to the root, going to meet the company people to really figure out what's going on. So I think certainly Chinese companies are professionalizing. There are great records if someone really wants to do research. Like we've all said, it is not easily apparent at the beginning, but there is a path. There is, in some ways, some great surprises about what you can find. And they're not very good as far as corporate governance yet, but they're professionalizing. But as far as corporate structures and transparency, I think there's a lot of research to be done, but it's really untangling all the complexities. Is where does an investment start? Where does it end? What does it mean that it's a private company or a state company?
Well, I want to push a little bit. Are the same levels of transparency available for the state-owned firms and state finance?
Not. It's actually more difficult for me to understand a state-owned company than a private company. Because with a state-owned company, I'm talking about corporate structures.
Right.
With a state-owned company, it may be a listed company, it may be a publicly traded company, and so you'll have lots of financials. You know the board of directors, you will know, the major shareholders of this state-owned company. But when you try to pull out all of the data about who's really controlling or what are the interests of the state-owned company, you're going to end with, well, it's owned by this part of the state. Whereas with private companies, I can go in and I can see exactly who the people are. I can see who their partners are. I can see, okay, this is a private company, but it's always partnering with an arm of the state government, this certain arm, this energy company. So there's a lot of things you can map and understand with a private company that you cannot with a state. So to me, at least, it's more interesting to follow the state company. They're more willing to talk to you than, the private company than a state company. So I just find the world of private companies in China, although far more complex, far more interesting than following the state companies.
Deborah, if we're looking at this, the sort of the source of investment, whether it's from a state or a private firm, how have you been able to compare the two in terms of accessibility to information when you're looking at these in particular investments in Africa?
Let me say two things about that. And one is that this is actually apropos of how do we find out about what state-owned or private companies are doing, because I'm looking to see what they're doing in Africa. I want to give a shout out to the Hong Kong Stock Exchange, because what we're finding is that listings by, whether it's state-owned, and often it is state-owned, when they set up a subsidiary in Hong Kong in order to raise funds, they have to give pretty transparent reports to the stock exchange about what they're doing overseas. And they also have to list the risks of those different engagements. And so we find a lot of our information about loans and investments and interesting stories about those coming through those Hong Kong Stock Exchange listings, and I'm sure those have been useful to you as well. It's a really great source. So when we're doing interviews with state-owned versus privately owned companies, I don't see a huge difference. I think what I try to do when I'm trying to get interviews is I use my networks. So I use all the guanxi that I have, and I try every way I can in order to try to get in to talk to the heads of these companies. And I've been successful, I think, in many cases, whether it's private or public. And some of them are even listed on LinkedIn. They're on LinkedIn. You use all of these different ways you can to try to get the interviews. And I have not noticed a big difference depending on the ownership.
I have a big difference, in fact. So if you go to the state-owned, the central state-owned enterprise in Brazil, for example, they're much close. They usually don't talk to the media. They don't go even to like high-level events. They only go if it's like a Chinese related high-level event. If you go to private companies, usually they have like either the president, like Chery Automobile, the president was Brazilian, like Jack Motors, the same. They would have like a VP that is usually Brazilian. I have participated in panels in Brazil where we had like someone from Bank of China, and one of the questions from the audience was, well, why don't you have a director or someone that's Brazilian that is part of your board there? And so they're able to mingle and to blend more into the society, which in some certain extent, I don't think that the central state-owned enterprise or the state-owned enterprise do in the same way. And they have their own organizations, and it's difficult for you when you visit, even when you visit a company that is like a state-owned enterprise company, but it feels different than visiting a private Chinese company in Brazil. It feels like you're visiting the government, whereas on the other, you're just visiting like a company. So these are more of my
If we look at
reactions to it.
If we look at how a Chinese aid project is sometimes developed, you have a Chinese contractor coming in to do the work and being financed by a Chinese institution. Okay, well, we don't know what the public procurement model is maybe on some of this, but how transparent is that relationship? If I'm in a government in Africa, maybe we'll come back to you as well for comment, Deborah. But if I'm in a government in Africa that is assuming a loan to build a project, can I get easy access to those accounts of how money is flowing in my name?
Mm-hmm. Well, in terms of procurement, and then I don't know if we're going to go back to like the host country regulations, because ultimately, because at least what I see from the Chinese in Brazil is that they follow the regulations that we have. We have like problems with corruption and everything, but you don't have Chinese money related in the middle, or Chinese are a part of that. So I see them following, but then you can start arguing or questioning, well, what about countries that don't have high standards for these regulations, and then I don't know if that goes like to the Chinese, it goes to the country, or like ultimately you could even argue that like when a company internationalized, they want to take advantage of these markets that they have like lower level regulations to export, being like labor or safeguards, or environment, because usually these regulations increase the cost of production for these companies, and then I don't know, that's a tough question, and I think.
Well, we know Western firms go shopping for cheaper labor markets and other things. It would be natural to assume that Chinese companies would do. But Deborah, I mean, you're looking across countries here. Are you seeing any trends that would say emanate from corporate behavior in China, or is this a function of the local regulatory environment in these African countries?
I think by and large, I would agree that the Chinese tend to follow the local environment, and that's the local regulatory environment. And in Africa, you have a lot of countries with very weak local regulatory environments. But you asked earlier about procurement practices and with Chinese foreign aid, and I would draw a distinction in the instrument that's being used. So the real oversees the official development assistance comes from the Ministry of Commerce, and usually they do have competitive bidding for those projects. Usually those projects are pretty small. But there's a whole process. There's a tender board, and you can see all of this on the website. They list the projects, they have competitive bidding, and maybe there's some collusion there, but it is competitive. On the other hand, the projects that are financed by the China Export-Import Bank, it behaves like our bank. Our Export-Import Bank doesn't say, okay, now we have this money for a project and we're going to have competitive bidding. That's not how it works. The company gets the project and then they bring it for financing from the Exim Bank. And so that's how it works also for them. They don't have people out there developing projects. It's the companies that develop the projects and bring them for financing. And so naturally, in that case, there's a lot of misunderstanding, because people looking at that might say, well, where was the competitive bidding going on? And if the country might say, well, this is a single financier, that the money is tied to Chinese companies, we couldn't do competitive bidding. That isn't actually true. They could do their own competitive bidding, and then whichever Chinese company wins that, which is usually for infrastructure going to be a Chinese company, they could then take the project for to get financing once they have the contract. So it's actually, there's nothing in the Exim Bank that says that we will not fund a project that has been competitively bid. There's nothing, no requirement like that.
Can I add to
Yeah,
that?
you wanted to comment, and I also wanted just to add, please do comment, but also, you know, the other anecdotes are out there are the effect of you know, projects that come in and bring in a workforce. You know, our work in Ethiopia, anecdotally again, the Ethiopian business community watched the construction of the Djibouti rail line and said there was nothing in it for us. Now, certainly there's long-term benefits to be gained from having a transit corridor, but in terms of who was employed, who supplied the construction, all those sorts of things, there was a concern that the local business community was not getting access to the benefits of the project.
Sure, thank you. Well, related to the procurement process, and what Deborah said is absolutely correct. There is a difference between the aid projects of the procurement process and the infrastructure-related procurement, which happens in the recipient country, in the host countries. But for the aid procurement, it actually happens in China. And if I remember correctly, most of the recipients of the aid projects or grants is similar to here, USAID. So it's Chinese organizations competing for MOFCOM aid projects. And I also believe they have a pool of qualified organizations for capacity building or education. They have universities or colleges. And for the the agricultural technology demonstration centers, they have companies, they have agricultural centers that are qualified in that pool. So I would say the aid procurement happens primarily in China. It doesn't really relate to any foreign organization. But for the infrastructure-related procurement that takes place in the host country, I remember reading Chinese reports, Chinese official media reports about. This was a couple of years ago, basically saying that 70% of the Chinese concessional loans are supposed to go to Chinese bidders or go to Chinese companies. So that number may have changed now. It could be lower or it could be higher. But there is an anecdote, a joke made by a Chinese Africa specialist on that, which is that, well, this Chinese way of doing the procurement, which is Chinese financing, but then the Chinese construction companies will get in the bid and win the contract, is actually conducive to the anti-corruption in African states, because the money never goes to Africa. It just changes
It
from.
funds Chinese corruption, maybe? Or?
It might. It just changes from one account under Chinese Exim to another account under another Chinese bank. So I think that's quite illustrative of how the money flows in that process. On the issue of the labor we hear a lot of stories about Chinese building infrastructure projects and bringing their own workers. And I have interviewed Chinese companies and Chinese officials about why don't you want to contribute to local job creation? And it is like a couple of reasons. And I think the most important one is that the Chinese want to finish the project as soon as possible. They do make a very strong efficiency argument that Chinese workers, they work 3 shifts a day, 24/7. They just want to finish the projects and then go home or go to the next country where they have the next project. So they do identify a gap between the quality of local skilled labor and the kind of labor that the Chinese projects would like to hire. So when they make the argument that, well, our projects are cheaper, which is because that we plan to build it faster, and also because that we have other ways to suppress the cost of the project. Like one Chinese construction company manager pointed out to me that they compare the quality of living for Chinese workers with quality of living for example, World Bank managers or someone dispatched from Washington, D.C. And so we never stay in hotels. We almost never have air conditioning. But that also gives us the incentive to finish the project quickly so that we can go home. So that's one argument. But you do see this push, I think, for vocational training for local laborers, especially youth in Africa, that they want to bring the younger population into the job market pool and to give them the training so that they will be equipped to work on the Chinese projects. But there, I think the Chinese companies make a very convenient argument that it takes time. So it takes time to train, for example, someone who can work on an engineering side or engineering project. And there's also this language barrier. So I do see, for example, in Southeast Asia, the Chinese infrastructure companies make that arguments a lot, that, oh, well, we do want to hire local people, and we are setting up training programs for the local people, but it's going to take some time before they can be fully trained and become capable of working at the Chinese construction sites. So I think that's convenient. I think it also, at least in my interpretation, I don't think the Chinese companies have exhausted all they could have done to bring the local laborers into their projects. But I think they also have their counter arguments pretty well prepared.
So the global trend we see in shared value investments has not reached the Chinese business community yet, where we're looking at a sustainable development model approach to investment as opposed to expedient project-based development.
If I could say just a few words about that with regard to the African data. What we find in Africa is that the use of Chinese workers is fairly limited. There are a lot of Chinese workers in Africa, make no mistake about it, but they tend to be in the countries that are high cost and where you really have large post-conflict problems. For example, in Angola. So Angola, there are lots and lots of Chinese workers, and you might find projects in which they're 60, 70, even 80% Chinese. That changes over time, so the numbers reduce the longer a Chinese company is operating locally. But and this would also be the case in Algeria, Libya before the Civil War, North Africa, and it was the case in Sudan as well. But in a place like Ethiopia, you're finding that in a construction project, you're having predominantly 70 to 80% of the workers are Ethiopian. And you might find, as Yunsun said, that Chinese workers, about 20% is still a lot. So you might have 3,000 workers in total on a project. If 20% of those are Chinese, and that's still quite a few Chinese people there. And because they will work practically 24/7, you might be going there in the evening and you'll see like it's all Chinese. But if you go there in the middle of the day, you'll see huge numbers of Ethiopians. They're just there for a much shorter period. And a second area where we've been doing research is in manufacturing investment. And it makes a lot of sense to think, why would the Chinese move Chinese workers from China to Africa to work in a factory? So you don't see that happening. They're going to places like Ethiopia because the cost of labor there is cheap. And so they will have Chinese supervisors, but the staff and the workplace is going to be African. And even as they've been there longer and longer, the line supervisors will become African as well. And we see some interesting examples where in some of these factories, people brought in to supervise or to do quality control are actually from Brazil and India and other places like that.
Interesting. I think we'd like to take the opportunity now, we've got about 20 minutes left, to open up the questioning to the floor. We have a microphone somewhere that's going to float. And if you could just give your affiliation and your name, that would be appreciated. You were the first to have your hand up right there.
Name's John Lipman.
Hold on, we'll get a microphone to you so we can. We have a microphone. Okay, just shout for now. Stand up, please, if you.
Would you differentiate between the example in Cuba, a more foreign affairs kind of investment with what you're seeing in the rest of the world? And are there more kind of rescue government investment scenarios being played out that we're just not seeing?
Who would like to take Cuba?
The Brazilian.
He's Brazilian, right? He's a Lusophone. He's not.
Yeah. No, well, if I don't know exactly if I understood the question, but as China as the lender of last resort, if it's China is the one that's going to help the countries when they're in they're facing some difficulties, I think that, as they mentioned here before, the experience that you have in Latin America is that that doesn't work out. It doesn't play out in the way that they expect. And it's not only the case of Venezuela, but I think also the case of Argentina, where they had problems with the previous government. So I think they also learn from that. And it goes back to the fact that like the Chinese, they learn in the way that they're like in the relationship with other countries, and they keep adapting and evolving. It's hard to have that impression of that they're going to have the same behavior and that will hold over time. And I don't know if what's going to happen with other countries in the future, but I think they're definitely going to think probably twice before engaging in this kind of relationship looking forward.
Anybody else want to comment about Cuba?
Not about Cuba, but I think it's a mistake to look at capital coming from China as all one thing, and as motivations being consistent in different countries and across the world. And for that regard, or for that reason, I find that your term corrosive capital to be a little dangerous and maybe not so helpful, because the Chinese are not, if this is not the Cold War, they're not going out there and helping and supporting and propping up their communist brethren around the world. It's not, it doesn't operate like that. And so we thought at one point that maybe Chinese capital was going disproportionately to authoritarian governments because the Chinese are more comfortable with that. But the Chinese are not dumb. You know, they know there are different kinds of authoritarian governments, and some are developmental and some are not. So they want to partner with Ethiopia because it's a developmental authoritarian government, but they don't want to partner so much with Zimbabwe because even though we thought that it looked like the Chinese were propping up Mugabe, what we found when we were digging into the loans, it actually, there wasn't that much going on. And what was going on was really tightly secured with some kind of revenue flow that could offer
But
repayment.
there was some speculation, though, in terms of Mugabe's departure, that there was contact with running the traps with Beijing to make sure that was going to be okay. Right?
It was, yeah, there was a lot of speculation about it,
Yeah.
and we don't really know. But certainly what we do know is that the Chinese didn't do anything. And what I said about that is that the Chinese are much more, they would, to actually intervene to save Mugabe would be an unusual act for them. And so what they did was just let things unfold, as they have done everywhere where they've been, at least in Africa. They have not tried to impede a transition. They've just moved smoothly from one government that they may have been looked as though they were supporting with their crony capitalism. But then when the next government came in, they were moving smoothly.
So maybe they were just
towards them.
negotiating the contracts over beforehand.
You know, I think they were just waiting to see what would happen, and not linking themselves to one particular leader.
I agree with Deborah. I think there are a lot of speculations about China playing a role in that in Zimbabwe, but I think it's just too obvious. It does not fit the behavior pattern of Chinese foreign policy. They want deniability. They don't want to be labeled that, oh, China actually supported the regime change in another country, because they have to think about what if that happens to China, that kind of behavior gives that legitimacy. So I think I agree with Deborah. But on the several communist countries, it depends on who you talk to in China. If you talk to scholars and officials who work on for example, Marxism, or what they call the communist internationalism, there is a very strong voice arguing that China should have communist internationalism towards a couple of communist countries still lingering on. And that includes North Korea, Vietnam, and Cuba. So I'll just say there.
That's interesting.
Wow, a lot of hands. You had your hand up earlier.
Wait for a mic.
Do we have a mic? No, just you have to speak up, I'm afraid.
Sorry. Excuse me.
If you can stand up too, because I don't think the people.
Yeah. My name's Arnold Zeitlin. I've been teaching in China, in Guangzhou for the last 15 years. Two questions, really. Is there a difference between loans, even at a concessional rate, and direct investment? And two, is investment being used by China to develop relationships, say, at the United Nations? So when the Chinese Navy blockades Taiwan, they can develop support in the Security Council for that act.
So I guess using finance as a foreign policy tool. Okay. question, anybody have comments? They wanna, you know?
I think that the data that we do have shows that there is a relationship in terms of official development assistance and UN voting patterns. I haven't looked that closely into that data, but what I would suspect is that in the case of African countries, a lot of them are aligned anyway with Chinese interests and sovereignty. So they would be voting with the Chinese on things like should Sudan be sanctioned for its role in Darfur, or which they would see as an internal affair, and also in the Zimbabwe, and a few cases from Africa that have come up in the Security Council. Of course, there was an article, was it just Sunday in the New York Times about our own desire to use our foreign aid for our own purposes and punishing countries
Well,
at the
China's
UN
not alone in this.
that don't vote with us about things like our capital moving to Jerusalem and things like that. But yeah, so I think this is a game that a lot of the great powers have been playing, and they're playing it too.
Next question. Back here, yes ma'am.
Hi, I'm Summer Tam from Smith Center. I have a question for Mr. Barbosa. Because you mentioned a lot about the coordination between Chinese government and private companies.
Mhm.
So could you elaborate a little bit more about like what the coordination looks like? And following on that, have the patterns of foreign investment of those companies changed since the BRI, or comparing those companies that participated in the BRI and with those that are not?
Yeah, I haven't studied the Belt and Road Initiative, whether there's, I mean, it's still relatively new, but on the first part of your question, the cooperation, so when you're looking at companies inside of China, whether they're state or private enterprise, the most important thing you have to have is a government relationship to get the licenses, to get the land, and to keep, the labor in shape, all of those things. So the government is everywhere, right, in China, so they control the economy. So if you're even a private company, you need to have very strong government relations, and of course that would translate if you're going overseas. You would need approvals, you would need to get the money out of China, the government has to okay that, and as you've seen with Wanda and HNA and Forsen and these others, they're making them bring it back or sell off some of these assets. So yes, there's a distinction obviously between a private company and a state-owned company, but a private entrepreneur, I meet lots of private entrepreneurs, when they leave China or even doing business inside of China, they say my number one thing is making sure we have that relationship, and then the government, whoever that is in the government, can say to them, this is part of what we would like to see, and that could translate. I don't think we're seeing it translate that much yet outside of China, but eventually you can imagine if they're that connected to the government, would it have to translate? So for instance, Wanda, when they started buying theaters, people were wondering, well, it's very close to the government, Wanda is tied to even Xi Jinping's family, will they do things that the president wants them to do outside of China? So I don't think we necessarily saw that with Wanda, but you can imagine that these private entrepreneurs are leaving China with the state in mind. And they also want to sell that to the Chinese government as, I'm going overseas to do something that helps China, to helps the nation, to bring back energy, resources, or new technologies. So lots of Chinese companies are going to Silicon Valley and saying, let's bring back technologies, bring back biotech, and help China develop these things.
Very back, right there.
Hi, I'm Anne Narkowitz. I'm an editor at China Channel with LA News.
You'll have to speak up just a little
sorry.
louder.
This question is primarily for Professor Baudigo. I'm wondering, with the use of Chinese labor rather than employing locals, I think you kind of touched on this a little, but if you can talk a little more about, I'm wondering if there's also local labor laws that would make it less efficient to hire locally, because there might be like issues with, say, working night shifts and 24/7.
There's a lot of variation. So you find Chinese companies working in South Africa, they bring in very few Chinese workers. They can't get a variance, essentially, and South Africa is very protective. They have a strong labor movement and so on. In other countries that may have labor legislation that's protective on the books, but they don't enforce it, then they hire locally because it's easy. They don't give them contracts, and so it's sort of easy as a construction company. You bring in somewhat or very weakly skilled, but people it doesn't take a lot to build their skill base, and then you just employ them by the day. And you may pay them in cash at the end of the day or at the end of the week, and then they don't have any severance pay or anything like that. Whereas with Chinese workers, they are much more efficient, and they're skilled and they're fast, but they're expensive. So you find bringing someone from China, you have to pay their airfare, you have to house them, and it may be that they're housed very simply, and I have seen where they've been housed as well, but it's still, you have to feed them, you have to pay something for them locally, and then they send back pay to their people at home. And they have options. So they can get jobs inside China now, whereas in 2 decades, 3 decades ago, this might have been really attractive. Now you have to really, there's a premium to bring in skilled Chinese workers to work in a construction project.
Back here.
Thank you. Leonardo Sempertegui. One question, I don't know who would like to answer this. What will be your forecast about Chinese companies and investment involvement towards rule of law in the recipient countries in the world? Because Chinese companies have shown a great flexibility to working in stable institution and countries, but they have displaced other kind of investments in such countries. So they are actually being an influence in the behavior towards rule of law. Do you think that they are going to keep working the way they do, or they are, let's say the word, maybe evolving towards something else in that field?
Chinese firms and rule of law issues.
I don't think the Chinese companies have an active agenda to undermine the rule of law of the recipient countries, meaning that their logic is not that we're going to go to Thailand and our goal is to make sure whatever legal system that's remaining in that country will crumble. I don't think that's their agenda. But what they do practice is that you see that when the Chinese way of putting it, when local conditions require, we would adapt our behaviors to what the local officials would like to see from us. So I think that's almost like an adaptation to the local business ecology. Is that helpful for the rule of law? I don't think so. But are they creating the problem? I think they exacerbate the problem.
I was going to say, can we look at this maybe from the perspective of sort of corporate citizenship? We have global norms and standards that might govern labor, and there were already some comments on the panel where certainly certain companies and supply chains and maybe European firms or others have greater consumer pressure to conform to laws. There are global standards and norms out there. How pressed do Chinese companies feel to adapt to these largely voluntary codes? I mean, their market isn't necessarily back in Europe or back in the United States where a consumer can push on for higher standards. So do we see Chinese companies coming to the global market in a sense and accepting these norms, or are they operating outside of these norms? What's sort of what can we see?
I just say that we talk about global norms. And we're actually talking, when we say that, we're talking about Washington, D.C. norms.
Well, we can be talking about Brussels norms.
And Europe's norms and London's norms and so on. We're not really talking about global norms, because what I see in Africa is that Chinese companies, by and large, have better corporate social responsibility standards than most local firms. And so there's a kind of hierarchy where firms that have the worst kinds of standards are locally owned African firms, and then the Chinese firms come in here, and then the Western firms come in here.
But there is a pressure that exists if you're supplying a Western firm, or you're part of a value chain in a Western firm, and you're a local company. There is pressure. People are watching you in those markets.
Yeah.
I'm not sure that those same pressures exist on a Chinese firm that's operating in those
They do
markets.
if they're also linked into those same value chains. So you can see, for example, Chinese companies in Ethiopia that are supplying H&M.
Mhm.
You know, they've got the same kinds of pressures that other companies in the supply chains have, and they respond to those. So it really depends
Yeah,
on
I
what they're
would-
linked to.
I would say that too, because for instance, Foxconn is considered a Chinese firm, although it's a Taiwanese firm. And if they go to Brazil to open a factory, they're really, the name is Foxconn, but they're supplying, say, Apple or Sony or one of the major brands. So those brands are going to bring their standards. So a Foxconn going abroad would be different from a state-owned company going abroad, which would be different from a private, small company. So for all of these Chinese companies, I think they do what anyone would do. They look at how can we go abroad? Is it efficient? Is it cost effective? Do we have to, when we have to comply with corporate governance or rule of law or even manufacturing standards, when they are forced to, they do. So the reason everyone gets their iPhone perfectly is because Apple forces them to, and so they force the workers, and so it's a chain. If it's a company that it started out as a small Chinese company in a small part of China and they go abroad for the first time, maybe they wouldn't go abroad with the same standards, but in China already you have all sorts of levels. I've been to the best factories in the world, and I have seen the worst factories in the world. I have seen home factories making pharmaceuticals. So you have all that range, and that range will go abroad. You'll have great Chinese factories, middle ones, and the ones that try to get around the rules. But I think what I saw in China was, over time, there's definitely improvement. Maybe it's not enough, maybe it's not up to Western or European or American standards, but you see Chinese companies getting better, complying more, producing better products, and making them for world standards.
I think an interesting thing to look forward and try to check what you're saying, because I agree with Deborah, you have like all the three levels, and I think like you have a level that is what the multilaterals do, like World Bank, IDB, they try to set the standards, they have like policy-based loans, they try to change the market where they are. So it'll be interesting to see what the new development bank or the Asian Investment Infrastructure Bank are going to do, if they're going to follow this model where they're going to enter in new markets and they're going to try to have higher standards, and that would be a clear sign that China is trying to move forward in this.
Are we getting any hints that that's the intention?
AIIB, we are.
That's what Jenny Chun keeps saying.
Yeah.
It will be lean and green and
Not mean.
and not mean.
Well, I'm going to be mean with time here, so I'm going to ask our panel for any final thoughts that they've got before we wind up. So maybe we'll start down at you with Andre and work our way back.
Yeah, well, just to finalize with the same idea that I ended my first commentary, the relationship, it's complex, it's much more than what people usually think, and it's very interesting to see what the local institutions are also doing, not only what the big outlet players are saying, because you can find a story that is very different from the one you think.
One thing that we did not cover is the debt trap that the Chinese concessional loans and the investment, especially in the infrastructure business, that has created in recipient countries. And I would say this is particularly dire in Southeast Asia, especially mainland Southeast Asia. You see some of the projects, like in the case of Burma, one project from China, the Jiaopyu Special Economic Zone, is like equals to about 16% of the annual GDP of the whole country. So it does raise a question, not only the commercial viability of these projects for China, but also what is the financial security implication for the recipient country in the future? What if they cannot pay back? Like the Sri Lanka case that you just mentioned, that what interest or what do they have to put on the table when they fail to meet the repayment terms with China? That's a question that I think lingers on people's mind, but no one has yet seen the answer.
Oh, that's a topic for another panel. Let's set
Yay.
something up.
All right.
I'm going to raise one comparison which hasn't come up, and that is, it's one I often make, but I think it's worth making again. And that's between China's rise now and Japan's rise in the 1970s. And what I see are a lot of parallels in how the Chinese think. when we talk about a lot of the global norms and the focus on democracy and so on, it's often that Japan is not at the table at a lot of those. It's Western, it's not Eastern. So Japan is a democracy, they're a well-developed Eastern country, and they think much more like the Chinese do. And so you find much more of a focus Japan had on the economy first and democracy later. I think a good example of this is that Japan has set up, or JICA, which is Japan's International Cooperation Agency, has set up a governance institute in Singapore. So they're thinking Singapore is a really well-governed state. And we might think from Washington, Singapore is an authoritarian state. You know, they don't show up well in the the Freedom House indicators and so on. But there's this focus on stability over democracy, the idea that governance will improve over time, and that economic development makes it happen. And so focus on that first.
I would like to end with, as a journalist, always searching for good data, a plea out there for us to get better data about China, about Chinese companies, about their investments, and to understand it in the complex way it should be understood. That we still, despite all of the things on Google that you can search, we still have a lot of misleading data out there. And so my goal as a journalist is to get deeper into the records to find better data about China.
Well, thank you. I think my takeaway from this is that, as with any business community, I mean, we've always say at SIPE that business is not a monolith, that there are many varieties, and there's a variety of stories certainly to tell about the nature of Chinese investment and how it works. And I think also that local governance matters. So, you know, as we've heard, Chinese firms will work well if the local laws and regulations are well developed and well enforced and clear. And that also the task at hand is for better and clearer information. And that's both a function of corporate governance and the companies themselves disclosing, but also the requirements of countries and governments around the world to require that of the firms doing business within their borders. So I would like to take this opportunity to thank our panelists. Hopefully we've managed to dispel a few shibboleths here, and also raise some new questions in terms of how governance and countries in general look at foreign investment and the questions that arise from that.